On the morning of November 18th, 1888, sleet hardened on the plank walks of Briarwood until each board shone like dark glass, and by first light the mercury at the rail office read 9 degrees below zero, a fall of more than 60 degrees from the deceptive thaw of the previous afternoon. The settlement held 312 souls, stretched along one freight spur and a rutted main street between cottonwoods and open range, and every household counted wood, coal, and lamp oil in days rather than weeks because the weekly fuel train had not arrived. Telegraph traffic from the north had gone silent after midnight. Men stood under eaves, striking mittened hands together and staring at the buried line poles as if force of attention might restore the wire. Women fed stoves too hard in fear and heard unfamiliar knocks in cast doors that had looked handsome in October catalog engravings. In the eastern lots, where wind crossed the flats without a fence line to slow it, Travis Murray opened his smithy before dawn and listened to the storm beginning to learn the shape of the town. He had not come west as a blacksmith. 5 years earlier, he had worn a collar and coat in Cheyenne as a railroad purchasing clerk, where he learned prices by the carload and signed ledgers that moved more iron in a week than his forge now touched in a season. When the graft scandal broke in 1883, it ruined guilty and innocent men with the same stroke, and the office where he had copied invoices by lamplight dissolved into hearings, sealed boxes, and names spoken with contempt in depots from Laramie to Omaha. No tribunal found his hand in theft. No company rehired him. On the frontier, acquittal did not restore standing once suspicion entered payroll books. He sold his watch, his desk chair, and a trunk of law manuals he had once thought would carry him upward, then hired on where he could, often where no other man wished to go. The winter that remade him came along the Platte in 1884, when he rode with a survey detail, laying temporary markers for a proposed sidetrack that never passed committee. Wages were delayed 3 months. Supplies were cut to flour, salt pork, and black coffee. During one stretch near Fort Laramie, the crew trapped in drifts learned that thin sheet stoves glowed bright, burned fuel fast, and went dead by midnight, while crude box heaters built from boilerplate and stone stayed moderate and dependable through the long dark. An old teamster named Gideon Vale, who had hauled freight in Montana Territory and wintered in dugouts across 2 decades, showed Travis how Earth remembered heat when metal forgot it. Vale did not speak in theories. He measured with hands, shovel blades, and time between feedings. He said a fire that saves a life is not the hottest fire, but the one that still breathes at dawn. In spring, Vale went south with another outfit and was later reported dead of fever near the Arkansas crossings. But his methods remained with Travis as exact as any entry in a freight ledger. By November of 1888, Travis Murray had been in Briarwood 2 full years and was known to most families as the man who set wagon tires, mended plowshares, reset mule shoes, and said little unless work required speech. He was 36, broad through shoulders and forearms, with a face marked by old windburn and coal ash that never seemed fully gone even on Sunday. The smithy itself had started as a failing wheelwright sheet on a low parcel. No speculator wanted because spring runoff pooled in the back lot. Travis bought it for $46 cash and $12 in deferred labor to the seller, then raised the floor with packed gravel, cut a drainage swale, and lined the forge wall with salvaged brick from a kiln collapse near Casper. Families with means did not visit unless an axle failed. They ordered from catalogs, paid wagon freight, and preferred polished cast-iron parlor stoves with nickel trim, mica windows, and names stamped in ornate relief: Royal Monarch, Winter Sovereign, Empire Home. Such stoves cost from $98 to $127 before pipe and installation. They promised elegance and rapid heat. They did not promise endurance under hard swings of temperature. damp fuel and overfiring by frightened hands. Travis began his sketches in a freight invoice book, whose original columns still faintly showed through his pencil lines. He drew a squat firebox made from thick plate, not cast in one brittle shell but assembled in sections that could be replaced when damaged. He specified a double wall around the burn chamber with an ash-packed jacket as insulation and shock buffer, then a broad top plate for cooking, and a side draw clean-out large enough for a gloved fist. The heart of his plan was not the stove alone but its marriage to earth. A clay and stone thermal bench, 3 feet thick at the base, 7 feet long and chest high, with internal channels that forced exhaust to travel before exiting the roof, surrendering heat to mass along the way. He had seen variants in railroad camps, sod houses, and one trapper's cellar near Julesburg, where 2 split cottonwood logs had kept 6 men alive through a week of wind. In Briarwood, where winter fuel arrived by schedule rather than abundance, retained heat was worth more than ornament. On the same day the telegraph failed, he walked to Pemberton Mercantile for rivets, pipe collar stock, and 2 pounds of stove black. Silas Pemberton stood behind the counter in a wool waistcoat trimmed with velvet, his beard brushed and oiled, his boots polished despite the weather. A prosperous figure among shelves that still looked full that morning. When Travis asked for credit until month end, Pemberton refused in a voice pitched for every customer to hear, and pointed with theatrical patience toward stacked crates marked Royal Monarch. He called Travis's design Murray's Cannon Coffin, and said no sane household would trust a salvage furnace built by a man who had lost his station and chosen mud over proper castings. Several men laughed because they had bought those castings. By noon, Pemberton had raised stovepipe from 18 cents to 41 cents per foot, claiming transport uncertainty and northern disruptions, and he repeated the nickname each time a new customer entered until boys outside took chalk to the smithy door and drew crude cannon wheels around the latch. Travis did not argue in the store. He paid cash for what he could carry at the old listed rates, still honored on those items, left without pipe, and walked 2 miles to a Fort surplus auction held in a wind-cut yard west of town. There he bid $27 for a cracked 6-pounder cannon tube decommissioned after muzzle damage, a relic useless for military service but rich in metal thickness no catalog stove could match. He borrowed a mule from the livery for $1.20, dragged the tube on a timber sled to his shop by lantern light, and set it on crib blocks before midnight. The next 3 days he marked cut lines in chalk and tallow, then sectioned the tube with hammer, cold chisel, and patient heats, converting curved fragments into workable plate. He flattened each section under a sledge top tool with a striker hired at $2 per day, drilled rivet runs at 1-inch spacing, and trued edges with a file until seams sat tight enough to hold lamp smoke without visible leak. By the final week of November, travelers entering Briarwood from the South Road could hear his hammer after dark and see a second glow behind the smithy where he had begun burning clay test bricks from creekbank silt, straw, and sand in a ratio he adjusted by fracture pattern each morning. He purchased common brick at $11 per thousand, fire brick seconds at $18 per hundred, and hauled fieldstone from a dry wash in 2 wagon trips paid with horseshoe labor rather than cash. The first assembled firebox stood only 30 inches high and 24 inches deep, yet its walls measured nearly half an inch in places once plate and jacket were set. It looked ungainly beside the catalog engravings pinned in Pemberton's window. It did not aim at beauty. It aimed at dawn, as sleet thickened into driven ice and the line north remained silent. Travis Murray laid out foundation trenches for the clay bench with a mason's line and measured every channel twice, building not for a parlor season but for the week when fuel failed, wind-erased streets, and heat had to be kept, not merely made. He set the mason line again, drove 2 iron pins into frozen ground with 5 measured blows each, and began packing the trench with alternating lifts of broken stone and clay, while sleet stitched itself into the shoulders of his coat. The foundation had to sit below the frostbite line, so he dug until the spade rang dull against compacted earth at 16 inches, then widened the cut to 36, so the bench would carry weight without settling when thaw came. He worked by lantern after dark, stopping only to rewarm his fingers above the forge and mark fresh measurements in the invoice book. At midnight, the temperature stood at 14 degrees below zero. By dawn, it had eased to 6 below, and the wind had turned northwest, steady and unkind. On November 20th, with the rail spur still idle, he laid the first fire brick in a bed of clay slip mixed with sifted ash and horsehair, a binder Gideon Vale had taught him beside a survey camp kettle where snow hissed on hot iron and men counted spoonfuls of flour. Vale had been a freight teamster with thick wrists and a bent left thumb from an axle break near Miles City, and he had held stubborn opinions on heat, shelter, and the vanity of polished tools. He used to tell green hands that cast ornaments fed pride while mass fed lungs, and he would prove it by placing one palm on thin stove skin, one on a stone warmed all day, then asking which one still offered comfort by morning. Travis had listened because hunger made instruction memorable, and because the old man never spoke to sound wise. He spoke to keep men alive. Briarwood knew none of that history. Briarwood knew only that Travis Murray had once kept books in a city office and now shoveled clay behind a smithy on poor ground. The town had prospered fast enough to trust appearances. 2 cattle outfits had posted strong numbers that autumn. Freight traffic had been regular through October, and new money had shown itself in lace curtains, walnut furniture, plated lampstands, and stove catalogs ordered in stacks from St. Louis and Chicago. Silas Pemberton placed the brightest castings at window height where afternoon sun could strike the nickel trim and set the embossed names glowing above the street. Men who bought on credit brought guests to admire them. Women compared oven doors and warming shelves after church. A hard winter belonged to memory, not expectation. By the first week of December, memory had begun to return to the land, whether Briarwood welcomed it or not. Frost drove down to 12 inches in the open lots. Cattle that usually spread the range by noon were bunching shoulder to shoulder along south fences before the dinner bell. Geese flew low and ragged, not in clean high chevrons, but in hurried broken lines, and they moved 3 weeks earlier than older ranch hands preferred to admit. Travis noted each sign and said little. He rose before light, fed the forge with cottonwood and coal cinders, and continued building. He forged hinge pins from 2 ruined wagon axles, bought for $3.10, upsetting each end by hand and drawing collars to hold weight without wobble when heated. He cut the cannon plate into matched sidewalls, then riveted a double shell around the fire chamber, leaving a 2-inch gap he packed with screened ash as insulation against sudden shock. He beveled seams, puddled welds at stress points, and set a removable baffle below the flue throat to slow draft and keep heat inside metal long enough to matter. The grate bars came from old harrow teeth straightened and peened flat. The door latch was plain strap iron, broad enough for mittened grip, with no decorative cast scrolls to crack or seize. When he returned to Pemberton for pipe elbows and collar stock paid in cash, the price board had climbed again, from 41 cents to 49 cents per foot for standard 6-inch run. Pemberton spread his hands and called it Northern Uncertainty, Transport Hazard, and Prudent Accounting, then glanced toward a cluster of customers and said, with practiced brightness, that Murray's cannon coffin would likely smoke the proprietor before Christmas. The laughter this time was thinner, but it still came. Travis asked for 22 feet of common pipe and 2 cleanout caps. counted coins onto the scarred plank counter, and carried the bundle out without reply. The boys renewed their chalk drawings on his door. Someone added a coffin lid with wagon wheels. He washed it off each morning with hot water before opening. His answer remained work. He set the stove into a bench cradle 3 feet thick at the base, 7 feet 2 inches long and 38 inches high, using fieldstone on the outer courses and fired brick in the channels where exhaust turned. The flue path ran 22 feet from firebox collar to roof exit, making 2 broad bends inside the bench before rising vertical through a clay thimble sleeve he cast himself. It was not elegant. It was exact. He checked draft with tallow smoke and paper ash, then sealed pin leaks with slip and sand until the pull stood steady at both low and hard burns. Final tally by December 28th, $63.40 in cash expense, plus 12 days of barter labor and 1 borrowed team return paid in shoeing. He named no invention. Others named it for him. On December 29th, during a noon lull at the Mercantile, Pemberton tapped a Royal Monarch side panel with his knuckles and addressed 3 ranch wives and a pair of drovers by the pickle barrels. He said the town would always have respectable heat as long as sensible households chose proven castings over dugout contraptions, and he warned that desperate winters invited desperate schemes. Then he smiled and asked whether anyone wished to retire for evening tea beside a cannon grave. The phrase traveled faster than freight. By supper, 2 boarding houses were repeating it. By Sunday, even men who had once nodded to Travis at the pump looked away first. On January the 3rd, 1889, wind dropped to nearly nothing, and the sky cleared with a brittle brightness that made window glass ring when tapped. At 11 in the morning, Eliza Dunn came to the smithy carrying a cracked skillet wrapped in feed sackcloth. She was 13, daughter of the telegraph operator, careful in speech and old enough to run messages when lines held. She found Travis drilling eye bolts into the corner posts of his shop, one at shoulder height and another near the sill, each backed by iron plates so the wood would not split under strain. She waited until he withdrew the bit, then asked whether the bolts were for freight slings. He told her they were for rope, and that rope would be for souls who might lose sight of walls in blowing snow. He told her a stove that held heat was only half a plan, because heat did no good if frightened neighbors could not reach it. Eliza listened, set down the skillet, and asked if she might carry 1 message before she went home. Travis gave her 2, both brief and clear. He asked her to tell the church sexton and the livery keeper that he would set lifelines by dusk and would need posts left clear at their doors. The messages were delivered within the hour. Neither man came to help. By the 2nd week of January's approach, he had strung hemp rope from smithy to well, from well to church, from church to livery, and from livery to the boarding house corner, each span anchored at roughly 40-foot intervals where a man could move hand over hand in blind drift and still find purchase before numbness stole judgment. He spliced loops every 10 feet for gloves. At crossings, he hung tin markers that rang when struck, so direction could be heard as well as felt. He tested each line at night with his eyes closed and a scarf over his nose, counting steps, memorizing turns. He converted the coal shed into a warming annex by sheathing interior studs with plank and packing sawdust between walls. On the north side, he stacked cottonwood cut to 16-inch lengths for predictable burn cycles. Along the rear bench, he stored 180 pounds of beans in lidded tins, 24 jars of rendered tallow, 6 sacks of coarse meal, and a kettle rack large enough for continuous broth. He spread straw over the floor and set narrow sleeping platforms from dismantled crates. The place smelled of clay, iron scale, lamp smoke, and readiness. Pemberton crossed the street once to inspect the rope line tied near the Mercantile hitch rail. He did not touch it. He looked up and down the emptying road. then called to a dray driver within earshot that Briarwood needed commerce in winter, not burrows and barn twine. He said panic had a talent for dressing itself as prudence. The driver laughed because Pemberton was a man of standing and because agreement cost nothing in clear weather. Yet the weather had already begun to choose its terms. On January 8th, the morning opened at 31 degrees, too mild for season, with a wet softness in the wind that left ruts shining and thawed the top crust from the alley drifts. By noon, the barometer at the rail office fell hard. By 3 o'clock, a gray wall had formed on the north horizon, not cloud alone but driven ground snow lifted from miles of open plain and carried low like smoke from a grass fire. Travis banked his stove with split cottonwood and checked every rope knot one final time. At sundown, the first gust struck the smithy broadside, and the building answered with a long timber groan that carried clear to the church steps. He set his shoulder against the door as the second gust struck, then dropped the bar into its brackets and moved to the rope map he had nailed beside the forge, touching each charcoal line with a blackened finger, as though confirming a ledger before shipment. The main run to the well held taut. The church span had slight slack near the second post. The livery line had twisted where it crossed the alley mouth. He took a coil of spare hemp, 2 iron mauls, a pouch of wedges, and a lantern hooded to a slit, then stepped into wind that drove ice crystals sideways hard enough to sting through beard and scarf. He worked methodically, not quickly, tightening each anchor chain, driving fresh stakes where frost had lifted old ones, and adding a second guide rope waist-high along the longest exposed stretch so a child and an elder could both find it by touch. The storm was not yet at full strength, but it had begun to test every promise he had built into wood, iron, clay, and line. At the well post he found Thomas Kerr from the livery, hat pulled low and coat half-buttoned, struggling to secure his own hitch rail as sleet turned to powdered snow. Kerr looked at the doubled rope and said, Travis was wasting good hemp on theatrics when men needed feed grain and coal. Travis handed him a mallet and pointed to the anchor eye. He said, in the same quiet register he used at the anvil, that a rope was cheaper than a funeral wagon and lighter to pull. Kerr stared at him for one breath, then drove 3 blows where he was told. They moved post to post for an hour without further speech, setting braces at 40-foot intervals, pinning turn points with iron rings forged from scrap wagon tire, and wrapping each knot in oiled rag so freezing rain could not turn fibers brittle by dawn. By full dark, the line network no longer looked like one man's precaution. It looked like infrastructure. Inside the smithy, the cannon coffin carried a steady orange bed behind its thick door, while the clay bench gave off a broad, low heat that did not flare and die but settled into the room like stored daylight. Travis checked surface temperatures with a tin cup of water and touch, marking with chalk where the bench warmed fastest and where lag remained. He opened the cleanout, scraped half a shovel of gray powder, and measured draft at the flue collar using a dangling strip of wool thread trimmed to 4 inches. The thread angled true at low feed and held at hard feed with no back puff, no smoke roll, no metallic ping from stressed plate. He shifted 2 fire bricks by a finger width in the second turn channel to reduce turbulence and keep soot from plating the bend. In the annex, he reset sleeping planks so aisles remained clear even when 50 souls lay shoulder to shoulder, and he hung numbered tags over each peg by the wall so gloves, scarves, and wet coats could be tracked and returned in order rather than lost in panic. By 8 o'clock, the first neighbors began crossing under the rope lines not to seek shelter, but to inspect what he had done, their lanterns bobbing in blown snow, their words still carrying the confidence of dry houses and stocked cupboards. Silas Pemberton arrived in a wool greatcoat with a silver-headed cane, accompanied by 2 ranch clerks and a teamster from the freight yard. He stood just inside the smithy threshold, eyes moving from the heavy stove door to the bench channels, then to the stacked tins and split cottonwood. His face remained composed, but his lips tightened when he saw the ledger board listing rations by pound and burn schedules by hour. He said this arrangement resembled a bunker for men who expected civilization to fail every season, and he asked whether Travis planned to collect boarding fees from frightened families after spreading alarm across town. Travis answered by setting a kettle on the top plate and inviting Pemberton to place his hand on the bench stone nearest the flue turn. Pemberton did not accept the invitation. He repeated the nickname, Murray's Cannon Coffin, with deliberate clarity, and the men with him laughed because hierarchy still stood, at least for that hour. Word of the encounter moved faster than the weather bulletin from the rail office. Before long, small acts of dismissal became organized and public. The church committee posted a notice requesting that householders avoid unverified alarm routes that might cause confusion during normal winter squalls. 2 boarders at the Prairie House sang a crude verse about burrowing blacksmiths and rope-walk penitents while unloading freight crates by lamplight. Boys scraped fresh chalk circles around the smithy latch after midnight, larger and wider than before, and someone nailed a broken stove shaker handle above the door like a warning placard. At Pemberton Mercantile, where shelves still held sugar loaves and lamp glass in orderly rows, customers were told that calm purchasing would preserve fair access for all, then sold stovepipe collars at 56 cents per foot and coal scuttles at nearly double autumn rates. When one widow asked for 2 extra sacks of nut coal on existing credit, she was refused with a sermon about market discipline. The community did not fail as one body. It failed in transactions, in glances, in rehearsed phrases spoken by souls who wished to remain on the side that appeared prosperous. Travis responded in the only register that did not feed the quarrel. He posted a board outside the smithy listing available shelter capacity, wood use per 6-hour watch, and rules for entry if the whiteout deepened. No open flame in bedding aisle, wet garments on east pegs, children and elders nearest bench center, all who could work assigned to wood, water, broth, or line duty. He charged nothing for admission. He asked no pledge and no apology. He spent the next hours preparing what mockery could not understand, splitting kindling by size bands for predictable ignition, pre-measuring bean rations into cloth sacks, filling 2 barrels with well water before pump handles froze, and placing sand buckets at both doors for footing. Eliza Dunn arrived with her father's old telegraph satchel and offered to copy names and assignments if families came in numbers too large to track by memory. Travis gave her a slate and chalk, set her at the annex table, and told her she would keep the count of souls and the count of ladles, because order and hunger was as necessary as fire in January. Near midnight, the sky disappeared. Snow no longer fell from above in visible flakes, but moved at ground height in hard, continuous sheets that erased wheel ruts and stair edges alike, filling the street until fences and porches seemed to float. Travis walked the longest rope run with Kerr and the Dunn telegraph operator, each man clipped to line with a short loop at the belt, so a sudden gust could not strip him from the road. At each post they struck the hanging tin markers and listened. The tones told distance and direction when sight failed. At the church corner marker, the sound came back muffled, absorbed by drift already piled chest-high against the south wall. At the livery turn, horses kicked and snorted in a rhythm that old stockmen recognized and younger men dismissed, a warning that came from muscle and instinct rather than words. Travis cut new notches into the corner post, so gloved hands could identify the turn even under packed ice, then added one final guide strand knee-high for those who might crawl if they could not stand. By dawn on January 9th, the rail office thermometer read 27 below zero and still falling. The barometer glass had dropped to a level not seen in 3 winters, and the aneroid needle quivered as though uncertain whether it had reached bottom. Travis watched the smoke from 3 nearby chimneys flatten at roofline and drive straight east in a dark ribbon, a sign of pressure and wind shear that made ordinary house drafts unreliable. He noted, too, that dogs across town had stopped barking and begun pressing under porches in silence, while cattle at the north lots stood rump to wind with frost pluming from their nostrils in short, sharp bursts. He sent Eliza with 2 written notices tied in oilcloth, one to the church sexton and one to Pemberton, each message plain: bring elders and children now. Bring bedding. Follow rope. Delay will cost lives. Eliza returned with 1 answer and 1 silence. The sexton sent thanks and said he would come once morning. Prayers ended. Pemberton sent no written reply, but told the messenger that reputable homes had proper stoves and required no burrow. The warning signs multiplied by the hour, each one small enough to dismiss in isolation and overwhelming in accumulation. A blue haze formed inside the blacksmith shop near floor level, despite clean draft, signaling fine snow infiltration through joints so tight they had never leaked smoke. Frost flowers spread inward along window putty in branching patterns Travis had seen only when outside air held severe dryness and velocity. At the boarding house, a stovepipe cap began rattling in a pulse that matched gust cycles rather than fire intensity, suggesting pressure reversals up the stack. The town clock at the church struck 10 with a dull, rapt tone because snow had packed inside the bell mouth. At the freight spur, signal flags froze rigid and snapped at the tie seams. Travis named each sign aloud to Kerr and the Dunn operator, not for drama but for sequence, then assigned responses as if dispatching crews on a line break. Reinforced door skirts with wet sacking that would freeze into seals. Reduce stove feed rates to avoid overfiring. Keep 1 person awake per room to watch draft and ember bed. Move loose fuel under cover. Tie children in pairs when crossing open stretches. Shortly before noon, Reverend Caleb Hodge came on the rope from the church with ice in his beard and 2 deacons at his back, not yet asking for shelter, but asking whether Travis might inspect the parsonage flue, where smoke had begun backing into the rear room. Their visit marked the first institutional bend in Briarwood's posture, modest yet significant, because authority had crossed the line it had told others to ignore. Travis took tools, spare collar stock, and a pouch of furnace cement made from clay, ash, and salt, then moved with them hand over hand through wind that now hit in blunt waves. At the parsonage, he found a hairline crack where cast iron met pipe collar, widened by thermal shock after repeated hard firings. He wrapped the joint with sheet scrap and wire, packed it with cement, and told the deacons to lower burn intensity and feed smaller splits at shorter intervals. Hodge thanked him with formal gravity and asked whether families should relocate to the smithy annex. Travis said they should relocate before dark, not after, and that any household waiting for certainty would run out of daylight first. By 1 in the afternoon, certainty arrived without announcement. A Royal Monarch stove in the Miller boarding kitchen gave a sharp report like a rifle shot as the side casting fractured from hinge seat to lower grate, spilling heat and ash where 6 laborers had been trying to boil water. No one was badly burned, yet the sound carried across the block and altered what argument had not. Men who had laughed at rope lines now held those lines with both hands, moving sacks, kettles, and bedrolls toward the smithy in urgent silence. Women arrived with children wrapped in quilts and flower cloths, boots tied at the neck with twine so small feet could be dried and relaced inside. Travis and Kerr counted them in at the annex door. Eliza marked names on slate, and the cannon coffin burned steady at the center of the room, its thick jacket dull and dark, its heat not flamboyant but persistent, the kind built to outlast the hour when pride surrendered to weather. By 2 o'clock, the wind had risen from hard to punishing, not moving around corners but striking straight through them, and the snow that crossed Briarwood no longer looked like weather at all, so much as ground turned to weapon, lifted and hurled until fences vanished and porches ended in white drop-offs where steps had been. Travis closed the annex door after the last family entered, checked Eliza Dunn's slate, and saw 31 souls already under his roof, with more clustered at the rope junction near the well, waiting for escorts in pairs because no one trusted an open crossing any longer. He sent Thomas Kerr and Reverend Caleb Hodge to the church span with lanterns tied low to preserve flame, and he ordered each returning group to keep one hand on rope and one hand on the shoulder in front. No exceptions, no arguments over pride. At 3 o'clock, the rail office thermometer was read at 35 degrees below zero. By sunset, it reached 42 below, and wind stripped the skin from exposed knuckles in minutes. The storm settled into a rhythm that mocked planning. 10 minutes of violent gust, 2 minutes of relative lull, then another strike from a slightly altered angle that found every flaw in siding, mortar, and pipe collar. Cast iron stoves that had burned hot and fast in November now glowed unevenly as damp wood and coal dust were fed in heavy charges by frightened hands. Side plates expanded, cooled, and expanded again. Hinges warped. Collar joints shrieked. A second Royal Monarch failed in the eastern boarding lane, then a Winter Sovereign in the Pike House, each fracture announced by the same brittle report that carried through drift like distant gunfire. The church committee's notice against alarm routes became useless paper by nightfall, pasted with frost to the vestibule post and half torn loose by wind. Families who had repeated it in daylight now moved bent double along Travis's ropes with blankets over heads and bundles tied at the waist. The line from church to smithy sagged under accumulating ice, so Travis and Kerr cut it free at one post, raised it with a forked pole, and re-anchored using a wagon axle sunk crosswise in frozen ground. Eliza stood at the annex table counting arrivals in a steady hand, while Mrs. Dunn ladled broth and marked children to the warm side of the bench by age and cough. Travis had set numbered pegs for garments and now enforced the order with blunt authority, because one lost mitten in that cold could become one ruined hand by morning. By the first night watch, 8 homes had lost reliable heat. By midnight, 12. Travis walked the route twice with a rope loop clipped at his belt and a hand sled behind him, carrying split cottonwood, kindling sacks, and patched collars. He entered homes where frost coated inside walls and lamp chimneys trembled in draft reversals. He reduced overfired boxes, split fuel into smaller charges, reset dampers, and moved elders toward interior rooms where possible. In 2 houses, he found imported stove doors bowed so badly they would not seat. He wired them shut with fencing strand and mudded seams with clay from his repair pouch, buying hours, not safety. At each doorway, he gave the same instruction, repeated until exhausted faces nodded. If the flue speaks in pops or if smoke hangs low, leave at once and follow rope to the smithy, no matter what bedding or dishes remain. Silas Pemberton tried to preserve his standing through the first night by keeping the mercantile open as a supply point. Lanterns in both front windows, price board still propped by the counter as if ordinary trade survived. Men came for pipe, coal scuttles, lamp wicks, and nails. By 10 o'clock, the shelves that had looked full in November showed gaps. By midnight, the stove parts crate was bare. At 1 in the morning, when a ranch hand asked for credit on 2 sacks of coal and a cap collar, Pemberton refused, then relented 5 minutes later when the hand returned with his wife wrapped in a horse blanket and frost whitening her eyelashes. The change did not come from mercy alone. It came from recognition. His own parlor stove had begun ticking in sharp metallic intervals, and heat in the back storeroom had dropped despite heavy feeding. Commerce had become triage. Profit had become arithmetic against dawn. The storm entered its second day, January 10th, without a sunrise any soul could see. Morning was only a slight thinning of dark behind driven white. Travis's roster reached 42 in shelter by breakfast. He split crews into watches: water, wood, broth, line escort, ash removal, and infirm corner. He posted burn cycles at 40-minute intervals and forbade any large feed that might spike temperature and crack his own seams. The cannon coffin answered with the same low, durable output it had given at first firing, and the clay bench, heated through the channels over many hours, held warmth even when the fire was banked for cleaning. Souls slept in shifts with boots near their hands and scarves drying on peg lines. The annex smelled of damp wool, smoke, beans, and human fear held in check by routine. Outside, routine failed everywhere else. The roof over the Miller boarding kitchen lost shingles and then boards. Snow drove through rafters and buried the stovetop in drifts formed indoors. At the freight yard, 2 boxcars derailed when a switch point froze packed and unseen under blown snow. No one was crushed, but grain sacks split and vanished beneath whitening gusts before teams could reach them. At the Dunn telegraph office, ice loads snapped the porch awning, and line poles to the north leaned at angles that promised weeks of silence. Horses in the livery stood flank to flank in steam and panic, and one bay gelding kicked through a stoleboard trying to turn from the wind noise under the door. The first death came before noon on the second day. Harlan Pike, who had mocked rope roots at supper 2 nights earlier, left his house with a coal scuttle and a shovel, intending to cross 10 feet from his porch to the side shed where dry fuel was stacked. Drift had erased the step edge. Wind took his hat, and then his direction. His wife found him less than an arm span from the threshold, one hand still clamped to the scuttle handle, knees set as though he had tried to rise again. Travis and Kerr brought him in wrapped in canvas because ground burial could not yet be cut. They laid him in the unheated tool room, hat over his face, and wrote his name on Eliza's slate, under a new heading no one wished to see. By dusk that same day, smoke incidents multiplied. Ruth Calder's flu, patched in December with catalog collar stock too thin for repeated stress, split along a seam where ice had formed outside, and then thawed under heavy firing. Smoke rolled low through her front room and blackened the lamp globe in minutes. Ruth wrapped her infant son Owen in a quilt, tried to hold the door against gust, and then abandoned the bedding pile when her brother Miles forced his way in from the yard and shouted for the rope. Miles found the line first and pulled Ruth and the child 3 posts toward church, but she had drawn too much smoke and collapsed at the 4th marker, her breath shallow and then gone before they reached the annex. Owen was carried in alive against her chest, coughing soot and barely responsive, and Mrs. Dunn and Reverend Hodge worked over him through the night at the infirm corner, while Travis kept the bench side clear for heat. Miles survived with burned lungs and frostbitten fingertips. Ruth Calder and her infant son Owen did not survive the second night. Their names were written beneath Harlan Pike's in Eliza's careful script, each letter straight despite her shaking hand. The storm did not grant pause for mourning. Early on January 11th, Deputy Amos Reed left the church with a lantern, line looped at his belt, intending to check the north cottages where 2 elders had not answered calls. He had made that route many times in clear weather and believed he could judge distance by stride. The drift between Church Wall and Pump Lane had become a moving trench. He lost the wall, then lost the rope when a gust spun him and pulled slack across his shoulder. Kerr and 2 ranch hands went out after him at first light tied in a 3-man chain. They found him kneeling against a fence post 20 yards off route, lantern out, gloves stiff with ice. He was carried to the smithy and warmed by bench edge while Reverend Hodge prayed over him, but his pulse failed by mid-morning. Amos Reed died with his badge in his coat pocket and snow still packed in the seams of his boots. 4 named dead changed the town's vocabulary more thoroughly than any sermon or lecture. Mockery ceased because breath was needed elsewhere. Doors that had been closed to Travis in December now opened without question when he knocked to inspect draft. Families who had laughed at ration boards now asked for assignments. By the third afternoon, the shelter count reached 47 souls, exactly the number Travis had once marked as maximum before air and floor would become unmanageable. He solved it by opening forge bay and annex alternately, rotating sleepers to keep moisture down, and setting 2 additional vent slits near rafters to release smoke accumulation while preserving bench heat. Late on January 11th, as gray daylight thinned again toward another blind night, Eliza Dunn appeared at the smithy inner door, with her scarf rimed in frost, and said there was a man on the rope from Mercantile who kept falling to one knee. Travis took a lantern and went out with Kerr clipped to the secondary line. 30 paces from the well post, they found Silas Pemberton leaning into wind, coat caked white, hands wrapped in a flour sack darkened by wet and freezing. Under his arm, he carried the cast-iron door from his own parlor stove, broken clean at the hinge ear, as if he had brought proof in place of speech. He was no longer the polished merchant framed by full shelves. His beard held ice to the chin. One cheek was pale and waxy with frostburn. The silver head of his cane was gone, replaced by a fence slat cut rough at one end. He tried to speak over the wind, failed, and held up the shattered door. Travis did not ask for explanation. He took the weight of Pemberton's arm over his shoulder, clipped a loop around the merchant's belt, and moved him hand over hand toward shelter while Kerr steadied from behind. At the annex threshold, Mrs. Dunn cut away the frozen flour sack and set Pemberton's hands in tepid water by stages, while Travis pointed him toward the wood stack and told him he could stand there once he could feel his fingers again. Pemberton stood unsteady for several minutes, then nodded once and began splitting 16-inch lengths on the block Travis indicated, each strike clumsy at first, then truer as warmth returned. No one in the room spoke of prices, nicknames, or window displays. Eliza marked his name on the slate among work assignments rather than under arrivals, and Reverend Hodge moved one bench space to make room for an elder from the North Cottages, brought in half an hour later. Outside, the whiteout continued its grinding assault on every brittle plan Briarwood had trusted. Inside, the cannon coffin burned without flourish, and Travis Murray kept the fire steady. Through the third night watch, he kept Pemberton at the block, then moved him to the annex stove ledger where wood had to be counted by length and weight instead of guesswork. And before dawn, the merchant who had once sold polished castings as symbols of rank was learning to shave kindling curls to a finger's width so a low bed could be raised without shocking iron. Travis taught by task and correction. He showed how to read flame color at the baffle slot, how to hear draft in the collar before smoke showed at eye level, and how to bank coals with ash so heat endured through sleep. In homes where imported stove shells had split, he and Kerr salvaged what remained useful, cutting warped doors into flat patches, turning nickel trim into strap braces and carrying cracked side plates back on sled runners to serve as wind baffles at annex vents. Costly failures became plain material. Pride became tool steel and scrap. By the morning of January the 12th, 1889, with wind easing from a scream to a hard constant and temperature climbing to 24 degrees below zero, the rope grid had become the only dependable map in Briarwood. Travis sent out 4 escort teams, each with 1 lantern, 1 shovel, 1 coil of spare hemp, and 1 sack of hot stones wrapped in feed cloth for numbed hands. Mrs. Dunn ran broth kettles without pause. Eliza kept 2 slates now, 1 for names and 1 for rations, crossing each entry with careful lines as if accuracy itself could keep panic from returning. Reverend Hodge and Miles Calder worked the infirm corner, warming lungs with steam and timing cough intervals for those who had taken smoke. At noon, Travis opened his stores with no reserve. beans by the cup, tallow by the spoon, meal by the handful, one measured share per soul per watch. He did not separate friend from mocker. He did not ask for payment. He asked only for labor if labor could be given. By that evening, 47 souls had slept under his roof in rotation, and all 47 were still alive. 3 days passed before the sky finally opened in broken blue, and the town could see what the storm had taken. Drifts stood to window lintels on the north side of Main Street. 17 homes were uninhabitable, either from collapsed roofs, fractured stoves, or interior smoke damage that had frozen into soot crust along rafters. The mercantile shelves were nearly bare. Pipe collars were gone, coal bins low, lamp oil down to 6 tins. Harlan Pike, Ruth Calder, Owen Calder, and Deputy Amos Reed were buried on January 16th when the ground could be cut by alternating fire pits and picks. Each coffin moved on rope lines laid flat over packed snow, and no one in the procession spoke above a whisper because the storm had already said enough. After burial, rescue became rebuilding. Travis moved from shelter captain to instructor without ceremony. He opened his forge books on a workbench scarred by years of axle repair and let any household copy measurements. Firebox plate not less than 3/8 inch where heat struck hardest. Ash jacket 2 inches. Flue run extended through bench channels for retained warmth. Clean-out access large enough for a gloved fist. He priced materials at what he had paid or what current freight demanded. And when families had no cash, he accepted labor exchange entered by date and task. One ranch hand hauled stone for 6 days to settle a $12 account. A widow stitched winter mitts for line crews and cleared her collar stock balance in 3 weeks. Pemberton delivered 30 feet of pipe from his private reserve to the church and did not mark the ledger. On January 22nd, the church called a plain meeting after dusk. No music and no social supper. Only benches, lanterns, and a stove that had been patched twice since the storm. Briarwood counted 308 souls now. The room held nearly all who could stand. Travis came in last from the smithy and remained near the rear wall, hat in hand, while Reverend Hodge said this gathering was for truth before spring labor swallowed memory. Then he sat down and left the floor to the town. Thomas Kerr spoke first, voice rough from cold and smoke. He said he had called the ropes theatrics at the well post while Travis was driving anchors, and he said those ropes were the path by which his own mother reached shelter on the second night when she could not see her own gate. He said mockery had cost him nothing when weather was fair, and would have cost him his family when weather turned, and he asked no pardon in that moment because he had not yet earned even the asking. He said he would set posts for any house that wanted them and would do it before branding season. Mrs. Dunn stood with Eliza beside her and spoke without ornament. She said she had repeated the phrase "cannon grave" at the pump because it made other women laugh, and because belonging can be purchased cheaply with one borrowed cruelty. She said her daughter had kept the death slate with hands that shook and still wrote straight, and she asked Briarwood to remember that children had carried order, while adults carried pride. She placed both slates on the front pew and left them there for all to read. Silas Pemberton rose after a long silence. Frost had healed to raw skin along his cheek, and his hands were wrapped in linen where sensation had not fully returned. He did not stand at the aisle, but walked to the stove so every soul could hear him without strain. He said he had named Travis Murray's work Murray's Cannon Coffin in his own store, and had repeated it for trade because ridicule sold better than caution. He said he had raised stovepipe from 18 cents to 41, then to 49, then to 56 per foot, while claiming necessity, though he knew fear was driving the purchase more than freight cost. He said he had refused credit to households who had paid him faithfully in easier seasons. He said he had believed commerce was leadership, and discovered in 1 week that leadership without duty was only appetite in a waistcoat. Then he set a cloth bag on the pew rail. Inside were ledger pages torn from his own book, marked with overcharges from November through January. He said each amount would be returned in goods or labor vouchers before planting, beginning with widows and then households with children. No one applauded. The room held stillness as weight, not theater. Others followed. 2 boarders admitted singing the borough verse and asked to join rebuilding crews. A deacon who had posted the notice against alarm routes said authority had hidden his fear and made it sound like policy. A ranch bookkeeper said he had laughed in the mercantile to protect his standing with men who signed his wages. Confession moved not as spectacle, but as inventory, item by item, each account tied to an action and a repair. By the time the lantern wicks burned low, the town had heard its own words returned without excuse. Reverend Hodge then asked Travis if he wished to answer. Travis did not step to the pulpit. He remained where he stood and spoke in the register he used at the forge, each sentence said as though it had to bear load. He said the dead required better houses, not better speeches, and he named them in order: Harlan Pike, Ruth Calder, Owen Calder, Amos Reed. He said any town that remembered only shame would freeze again, for the same reasons, because shame can be hidden while instruction cannot. He said he did not build the stove and bench to win an argument, and he would not use survival as a platform to collect deference. He said he would teach every willing hand to build thick jacket heaters, clay benches, and rope roots before next snow. But teaching would be work, not ceremony. Measured cuts, honest ledgers, shared watches, and duties kept when weather looked mild. He said forgiveness was not a receipt stamped paid on one winter night. It would be measured in whether Briarwood changed its habits while the sky was clear. By the first week of February, change had taken shape in wood, iron, and routine. Crews worked by district, 3 days each lot, beginning with elders and families displaced by smoke damage. Travis trained 12 regular helpers at the forge, including Pemberton, who learned to drill rivet lines straight and to reject any casting too thin for severe feed cycles, no matter how ornate its face. The phrase cannon coffin disappeared. In its place, children carrying split wood between houses began saying cannon true when a joint held tight or a knot was tied right. And by spring the phrase had crossed into adult speech without irony. 31 homes and both public buildings would eventually adopt the Murray pattern heater, but its first proof came that same year, when a March cold snap dropped to 18 below and no major stove failed across the new builds. Years later, travelers entering Briarwood in winter still saw the smithy refugee standing on its once disdained low parcel, foundation raised, drains cut deeper, rope anchors painted red against snow glare. The annex wall still carried peg numbers. The bench still held heat through night watches. Families still kept a posted burn schedule by each stove, and line teams still inspected root knots every November after the first hard freeze. Pemberton Mercantile remained open under new terms written after the storm. Emergency staples at fixed winter margins, credit protections for vulnerable households, price changes posted with freight receipts attached. The policy was copied by 2 neighboring settlements within a decade. In the present winter light, the inscription above the smithy door remains plain and legible, cut into oak and darkened with lamp black so weather cannot erase it. Heat kept is life shared. School children trace the letters with mittened fingers while elders tell them why the words matter. They are told about iron that cracked when it was thin and proud, and iron that endured when it was thick, patched and married to stone. They are told that practical wisdom is not old superstition, but disciplined care carried from one hard season to the next. They are told that Briarwood was saved not by wealth, nor by ornament, nor by speeches after the wind, but by preparation offered freely when pride had already failed. After that lesson is spoken, Eliza Dunn lifts the latch to the annex and invites the children inside, where the old peg numbers remain painted above the wall rail and the clay bench still gives back heat in a long, patient breath. She no longer carries a telegraph satchel. She carries a cedar box with iron corners, and she sets it on the same table where she once kept the 2 slates. Travis Murray stands near the stove, 70 years old now, shoulders narrower than they were in 1889, but hands steady as he opens the fire door and shows the youngest boys how the coals should lie, not piled into a blaze that flatters fear, but spread even, with one brighter seam at the rear where draft draws true. He has taught this motion so many winters that his wrist turns without haste. 2 girls from the north lots count aloud while he adjusts the damper by half a finger. Eliza opens the box. First she raises the death slate, black stone worn gray at the edges, and reads each name as the room falls still. Harlan Pike, Ruth Calder, Owen Calder, Amos Reed. Then she turns the second slate, where ration marks run in neat columns, and she points to the narrow strokes that held order when panic pressed against every door. She tells the children that both slates were offered to the church archive in 1890, and that Travis refused to let them vanish into a cupboard. He required that they remain in the refuge each winter so memory would stay where work is done. From the same box, she draws the torn mercantile ledger pages Silas Pemberton surrendered on that January night, each overcharge marked in his own hand. The pages are brittle now, but each refund entry is countersigned by a household head or witness. Caleb Hodge signed for widows who could not write. Thomas Kerr signed for line crews paid in goods. Ruth Calder's brother Miles signed with a shaking X because smoke had scarred his lungs and frost had taken feeling from 2 fingers. Every debt raised by fear was paid back by planting time of 1889, down to single cents on pipe collars, and Eliza taps each signature so the children can see that reckoning required arithmetic, not sentiment. On the annex wall above the woodblock hangs the broken cast-iron stove door Pemberton carried through the whiteout. Its hinge ear remains split clean, fracture grain bright where heat and cold fought each other too hard. Travis had kept it on the floor through that first spring while crews trained, then mounted it in oak as a permanent warning. Beneath it hangs a small plate forged from cannon scrap. Thin pride breaks, thick duty holds. By late afternoon, neighbors arrive in 1s and 2s for the January instruction watch, a custom fixed by town vote in 1892 and never omitted since. No one attends as spectator. Each soul takes a station. Kerr descendants test rope tension at the well and report knotwear. Calder cousins inspect flue collars by church and schoolhouse with feeler wire and clay patch pouches. 2 Pemberton grandsons carry pipe lengths and chalk out emergency routes where new sheds changed windbreaks. They do the work without ceremony because this has become the grammar of winter in Briarwood. At dusk, when the bell strikes clear instead of muffled, Reverend Hodges' successor reads the winter duty register from the church steps, and each household answers present with its assigned watch. The register includes details outsiders once mocked: fuel set aside in measured cords by November 1st, bean and meal reserve by weight, rope anchor checks after first hard freeze, stove wall thickness minimums, and shelter capacity by room. After the storm years, the town and rail office also signed a winter fuel accord, twice monthly coal deliveries fixed from October through March, backed by 2 local reserve depots sized for 6 weeks of burn, with automatic release on missed trains. The missed train fuel vulnerability was closed by contract and stock, not hope. When a new family joins the town, they are taught the code before they are given voting standing. Commerce follows the code. Pride does not override it. That same evening, Silas Pemberton, old and stooped, asks Travis for a private word by the smithy door. He has spoken publicly before, yet one account remained unfinished and he has carried it for years. Snow dust turns in lamplight while he removes his gloves and holds his hands to the bench warmth, fingers scarred where frost once bit deep. "I looked at your rope line on January 8th, he says, voice low and deliberate. I looked at the barometer in my own office 1 hour later and saw it fall faster than any mark in my books. I knew your warning had weight. I still mocked it in front of men because I feared losing trade more than I feared losing neighbors. That was the exact hour of my failure, and I did not name that hour in church." Travis studies him, then sets one split stick on the coal bed and waits until it catches along the edge. "You have named it now," he says. "Keep naming it to those who inherit your counter. Silence is how bad weather enters first." Pemberton nods once. He does not ask for comfort. He asks for task. Travis sends him to the annex shelves to verify emergency staple counts against posted margins, and the old merchant reads each line aloud while Eliza records: beans, tallow, meal, lamp oil, pipe collars, glove wool, soap. Every item is matched, signed, and posted with freight receipts, exactly as the reform required. No storekeeper in Briarwood is permitted to change winter prices without those receipts attached at the door. When full dark settles, Travis gathers the apprentices around the rope map, which has been recopied across years, but still follows the same bones he set in 1889. He points to the church turn, the livery span, the well post, and he makes the older boys walk the route, blindfolded by lantern sound alone, striking each tin marker to confirm direction by tone. He explains why the marker at the church corner is brass, while the well marker is iron. One rings sharp through dry wind, one carries low through drifting ground snow. He explains why dogs going silent under porches is logged as a warning sign in the register, and why cattle bunching south before noon still triggers early shelter call. He explains that the geese and frost depth notes are not folklore but field observation with dates attached. The children write each sign on slate and repeat it back. Near midnight, a rider arrives from the repaired North Line with a packet from the rail superintendent in Casper. The message confirms what Briarwood inferred long ago. In January 1889, pole failures and drift burial had broken telegraph continuity across 3 segments, and the fuel train missed Briarwood because 2 locomotives were trapped behind a blocked cut for 4 days. The superintendent encloses copied dispatch sheets and a note praising Briarwood's rope and shelter methods, requesting permission to circulate the design to smaller depots. Travis reads the packet once, passes it to Eliza, and asks her to place it in the cedar box with the slates and ledgers, so the final external silence from that winter is now answered in writing. By morning, the instruction watch closes with practical exchange. One household brings 2 sacks of lime for bench repairs. Another brings seasoned cottonwood. Travis gives in return a set of rivet templates cut from the last unused plate of cannon iron, the final physical remnant of the 6-pounder tube he hauled behind a mule for $27 in stubborn faith. He had kept that plate for years against uncertainty. This day he marks it for use, because reserve that never enters service is only hoarding under a respectable name. At noon, children file past the stove door relic and touch the oak inscription above the smithy threshold. Heat moves from bench stone into their mittens. Rope lines hum lightly outside in a steady wind. The town that once laughed now trains by measurement, stores by ledger, and shelters by duty. Travis watches them go, then closes the register and hangs it by the door, where any soul can read it before winter chooses its terms again.